Marcus Accoy had been talking to himself for so long that he'd stopped noticing he was doing it, which was probably a sign of something psychological that he should mention to medical when he got back to civilization. Assuming civilization still existed and hadn't collapsed, while he was alone on this derelict station for what felt like approximately 700 years, but was actually only 73 days according to the chronometer, he checked obsessively every morning. He was currently wedged into maintenance shaft 7 Delta, which had definitely not been designed for someone of his build, attempting to disconnect a power coupling that had apparently been welded into place by spite and cosmic malevolence. Right, so the problem here, he muttered, adjusting his plasma cutter to a lower setting, is that whoever designed this junction clearly hated future engineers and wanted us to suffer. This is personal. This is a grudge that transcends time and space. The coupling remained stubbornly attached despite his best efforts and increasingly creative profanity. You know what, fine. We're going to do this the hard way, which is the only way anything ever gets done on this station, because apparently the original construction crew was selected based on their ability to create maximum frustration for salvage operations. Station Acheron had been abandoned for 42 years, left to drift in high orbit after the experimental quantum drives that powered it proved catastrophically unstable in ways that were apparently classified even now. The Terran Reclamation Corps had sent Marcus here alone because budget constraints meant solo operations, and he'd volunteered because the hazard pay was excellent, and because he'd needed to get away from Earth for reasons he tried not to think about during the long, silent days. The station was a maze of corridors and abandoned dreams, full of equipment that had cost fortunes and been left to the void when humanity decided maybe quantum drives were a terrible idea actually. The thing is, Marcus continued, bracing himself against the shaft walls for better leverage, this station represents someone's vision of the future. Someone designed these systems, built these corridors, imagined people living and working here. And now we're just stripping it for parts like it's not a monument to ambition and hope, and probably several unfortunate accidents involving quantum instability. Feels disrespectful, honestly. The coupling finally gave way with a shower of sparks that would have been alarming if Marcus hadn't already experienced 17 different types of alarming incidents this week alone. Got you, you stubborn piece of. An interesting perspective for a salvage engineer, said a voice behind him, smooth and accented and definitely not his own. Most would consider efficiency more important than sentiment. Marcus jerked so hard, he hit his head on the maintenance shaft ceiling, dropped his plasma cutter, and said several words that probably violated about 4 different sections of the Reclamation Corps Conduct Manual. He extracted himself from the shaft with none of the grace he'd used entering it, emerging into the corridor covered in grease and experiencing what medical would definitely classify as acute cardiovascular stress. Standing approximately 3 meters away, arms crossed and expression somewhere between amused and analytical, was a woman who was definitely not human and definitely should not have been on this station. She was tall, maybe 2 meters, with the elegant, elongated ears that marked her as Vashran, one of the species humanity had encountered during the awkward early years of interstellar expansion, when everyone was still figuring out how not to accidentally declare war through unfortunate translation errors. Her ears were tilted slightly forward in what Marcus's xenobiology briefings had indicated meant focused attention, and she wore light armor in dark colors that looked designed for mobility rather than protection. Her face had the sharp, angular features common to Vashran, and her dark eyes held the kind of analytical focus Marcus associated with people who were significantly smarter than him and knew it. "How long have you been there?" he managed, his voice coming out higher than he would have preferred. His brain was frantically cycling through everything he'd said in the past hour, trying to remember if he'd mentioned anything classified or just embarrassing. 3 days, she said calmly, as if this was a completely reasonable answer to provide. Though I've only been actively listening for the past 72 hours. The first day I was primarily focused on structural assessment and resource inventory. Marcus's brain struggled to process this information. 3 days. You've been watching me for 3 days. Observing, she corrected. Watching implies passive interest. I've been actively studying your behavioral patterns, linguistic habits, problem-solving methodology, and psychological responses to isolation. You talk to yourself constantly. Is this typical human behavior, or is it a specific coping mechanism for extended solo operations? She tilted her head slightly, ears adjusting to catch ambient sounds from deeper in the station. I'm genuinely curious. My cultural briefings on human psychology were apparently incomplete. You can't just spy on people. Marcus was aware he sounded like he was complaining about playground rules, but his brain hadn't fully caught up to the situation yet. I wasn't aware you had claimed exclusive salvage rights to this station. Vashran Ascendancy records indicate our claim is equally valid, filed approximately 6 days before your organization's. She moved closer with the kind of fluid grace that suggested either dance training or combat training, possibly both. I'm Operative Thulnara of the Vashran Ascendancy Intelligence Corps, assigned to conduct reconnaissance and strategic assessment of potentially valuable derelict assets in this sector. I've been evaluating Acheron Station for the past week. By watching me fix power couplings and complain about freeze-dried food. Among other activities, yes. You also conducted a 15-minute ethical debate with yourself yesterday about whether salvaging the station's memorial plaque constituted cultural vandalism. That was particularly illuminating. She paused, and something that might have been a smile crossed her features. For what it's worth, I agreed with your conclusion that the plaque should be preserved and archived rather than melted down for raw materials. Your supervisor's response, suggesting you were being inefficiently sentimental, was unnecessarily dismissive. Despite the profound weirdness of the situation, Marcus felt a small surge of vindication. Thank you. Director Kamara thinks I'm being ridiculous, but that plaque has the names of 47 people who worked on the station. That means something. It means they existed and contributed to something they believed was important. Erasing that record for marginal material gain seems counterproductive from both a historical and a moral perspective. Thulnara gestured at the maintenance shaft he'd been working in. The power coupling you were attempting to disconnect has a secondary failsafe mechanism you hadn't accounted for. There's a manual override approximately 30 centimeters to the left of your primary access point. I noticed it during my second survey of this section. Marcus stared at her. How do you know that? I've been studying the station system's architecture for a week. Unlike you, I work in silence and therefore process observational data more efficiently. But there was something almost playful in her tone that suggested she was enjoying this interaction more than her professional demeanor indicated. Although I'm beginning to understand that your verbal processing serves a different purpose than I initially assumed. Against all logic and despite the fact that this was objectively a very strange and potentially problematic situation, Marcus found himself almost smiling. Right. Well, thank you for the information, I guess. And for not, I don't know, killing me in my sleep, or whatever intelligence operatives usually do to people in my situation. I considered various approaches on day 2, when you spent approximately 20 minutes singing what I can only assume was some form of human cultural anthem about a beverage called beer. The acoustics in the residential section are unfortunately quite good, and the repetitive chorus was challenging from an auditory perspective. Now she was definitely smiling. However, your engineering competence is sufficient to warrant preserving your existence. Also, your running commentary has been significantly more entertaining than my usual reconnaissance assignments, which typically involve watching security footage in silence for extended periods. Marcus didn't know whether to be offended or amused. He settled for curious. What exactly have you been learning from watching me talk to myself? That human cognitive processing is significantly more complex than standard intelligence briefings suggest. That verbal externalization serves multiple functions including emotional regulation, problem-solving support, and memory consolidation. That you anthropomorphize machinery in ways that seem irrational but actually help you maintain focus during repetitive tasks. That you have ethical considerations about salvage work that your organization apparently doesn't value, but that suggests a psychological sophistication our assessments have missed. She paused. Also that your freeze-dried rations are apparently terrible, and you have strong opinions about this. They taste like nutritional punishment. I've been complaining about them for weeks. I heard. I thought you were exaggerating for dramatic effect. Volnara's expression shifted slightly. I tested one of your ration packs last night. You were not exaggerating. The chicken curry variant is genuinely offensive to multiple senses simultaneously. Despite everything, the shock, the confusion, the fact that he was apparently having a casual conversation with an intelligence operative from another species, Marcus laughed. It felt strange, using those muscles after so long alone, but it also felt good. That's the most honest thing anyone said to me in months. Everyone at Reclamation Corps just tells me to be grateful for provisions. But gratitude and quality are not mutually exclusive concepts. One can appreciate having food while acknowledging it tastes like compressed regret. Volnara moved toward the maintenance shaft, examining the coupling he'd been working on with professional interest. May I? Marcus gestured at it, still processing the surreal nature of the situation. Be my guest. She reached into the shaft with the confidence of someone who'd studied the station's schematics extensively, found the manual override she'd mentioned, and disconnected the coupling in approximately 15 seconds. When she withdrew, she was holding the component and looking vaguely satisfied. Efficient application of available knowledge. This is why intelligence gathering matters. Information prevents unnecessary struggle. Show off, Marcus said, but without heat. He took the coupling from her, noting it was exactly the part he needed and that he'd probably have spent another hour fighting with it. So what happens now? Do you report back that there's a human salvage operation here? Do I report that there's a Vashran intelligence operative? Do we fight to the death over salvage rights using nothing but plasma cutters and determination? Those all seem unnecessarily complicated. Volnara considered him carefully. I should report your presence. You should report mine. We would both be following proper protocol. However, protocol would likely result in lengthy jurisdictional disputes, possible diplomatic complications, and neither of us actually completing our assigned work for several weeks, while bureaucrats argue about orbital sovereignty. That does sound inefficient. Extremely. Alternative suggestion. We continue operating as we have been, with the modification that I stop observing from shadows and we coordinate our activities to avoid interference. You continue your salvage operations. I complete my strategic assessment, and we both file reports that are technically accurate but strategically incomplete regarding the presence of other parties. Marcus should have said no. He should have immediately contacted Director Camara, followed proper procedures, let the Reclamation Corps legal team handle the jurisdictional complexity. But he'd been alone for 73 days, and Volnara was the first person who'd listened to his thoughts, really listened, even the ridiculous parts, and found them worth considering rather than dismissing. That felt more important than protocol. That's probably a terrible idea, he said. I'm in. Volnara's smile was small but genuine. Your species' tendency toward prioritizing personal connection over bureaucratic efficiency is going to cause significant diplomatic complications someday. Probably, but maybe some complications are worth it. Marcus gestured vaguely at the station around them. Besides, You already know everything embarrassing about me. Seems inefficient to start over with proper formal procedures now. A logical argument. I appreciate your commitment to efficiency despite your tendency toward verbose self-narration. She moved toward the corridor junction. I've been working in Section 9, evaluating the quantum drive containment systems. I'll continue there. You're focused on Sections 4 through 8, correct? Power systems and life support infrastructure, yeah. Trying to determine what's worth extracting versus what's too degraded to salvage. Then we shouldn't interfere with each other's operations. I suggest we meet at 1900 hours in the observation deck. It's the only section with acceptable environmental controls, and the view of Earth is tolerable for extended periods. We can coordinate schedules and discuss any overlapping resource requirements. She paused. Also, I'm curious about your ethical framework regarding salvage operations, and having that discussion in person seems more efficient than continuing to observe from hiding. Marcus found himself looking forward to 1900 hours more than he'd looked forward to anything in months. It's a date. I mean, not a date. A professional coordination meeting, with discussion of ethical frameworks. I understood your intent. Human linguistic imprecision is noted in my briefings. But Thulnara's ears tilted in what might have been amusement. 1900 hours, Engineer Akoi. Try not to injure yourself with any more stubborn power couplings before then. She disappeared into the shadows of the station, with the kind of practiced silence that reminded Marcus she was, in fact, an intelligence operative trained in reconnaissance and probably several forms of armed combat. He stood alone in the corridor, except not alone anymore, and realized he was smiling for the first time in weeks. "Well," he said to the empty air, then paused. "Are you still listening, or have you actually left?" "I've left," came Thulnara's voice from somewhere deeper in the station, carrying that edge of amusement. "But I appreciate your awareness that I might still be present. That's good operational security instinct. Just wanted to make sure before I started talking to myself again. Feel free to continue your verbal processing. I find it informative, though perhaps avoid additional beer anthems." Marcus laughed, and the sound echoed through Acheron's empty corridors, filling the space with something that felt like hope and possibility, and the strange promise of connection in the most unlikely of places. The observation deck at 1900 hours looked exactly as it had for the past 73 days. Empty, silent, and offering a view of Earth that was beautiful enough to make Marcus's chest ache with homesickness. He tried not to examine too closely. He'd arrived 15 minutes early because nervousness made him punctual, carrying 2 of the terrible freeze-dried meal packets, and some coffee that was technically coffee in the same way that paint thinner was technically a beverage. Thulnara materialized from the shadows at exactly 1900 hours, moving with that same predatory grace that suggested she could probably kill him in 17 different ways before he finished being alarmed about the first one. "You're early," she observed, settling into one of the observation chairs with the careful posture of someone who'd been trained in formal etiquette and never quite managed to abandon it. Human cultural material suggests this indicates either anxiety or enthusiasm, which applies in your case. "Can it be both?" Marcus offered her one of the meal packets. "I brought dinner. It's terrible, but it's hot and technically contains protein." Thulnara examined the packet with the focus of someone conducting a forensic analysis. "Beef stroganoff variant. I haven't tested this one yet. How offensive is it compared to the chicken curry?" "Different kind of offensive." The curry was aggressively spicy in a way that suggested the manufacturer was angry at someone. The stroganoff tastes like someone described beef to an algorithm that had never encountered actual food, and the algorithm did its best. That's impressively specific criticism. Thulnara activated the heating element and waited with visible patience for the meal to reach appropriate temperature. In Vashran culture, We consider excessive focus on food quality to be a sign of insufficient mental discipline. Sustenance should be efficient and nutritionally adequate. Pleasure is considered secondary. That sounds absolutely miserable. It's practical. Emotional attachment to sensory experiences creates vulnerabilities that can be exploited. She took a cautious bite of the rehydrated stroganoff, and her expression cycled through several configurations before settling on resigned disgust. However, I'm beginning to understand why you complain so extensively. This is genuinely terrible in ways that transcend cultural preference. Marcus grinned despite himself. Welcome to salvage operation cuisine. It gets worse the longer you're out here because your taste buds start forgetting what actual food is supposed to be like. A horrifying prospect. Vulnara set the meal aside with obvious relief. Perhaps we should discuss something other than nutritional disappointment. You mentioned yesterday, while arguing with a power regulator that couldn't hear you, that salvage work creates ethical complications regarding historical preservation. Elaborate on that perspective. It took Marcus a moment to remember the specific ranch she was referencing, which was embarrassing because apparently she had better recall of his verbal processing than he did. Right, the memorial plaque thing. He paused, trying to organize thoughts he usually just released into the void without structure. This station represents 47 people's life work. They spent years building this, believing they were creating something important. And yeah, the quantum drives failed and the project was abandoned, and now it's just derelict infrastructure. But that doesn't erase what it meant to the people who built it. Stripping it for parts without acknowledging that history feels like we're saying their work didn't matter. But practically speaking, preserving non-functional infrastructure serves no strategic purpose. Vulnara's tone wasn't argumentative, more analytical. The materials can be repurposed for current projects with actual utility. Sure, but we're not just materials. We're memory and meaning and the record of what we tried to accomplish even when we failed. Marcus gestured at Earth through the viewport. Someday someone's going to salvage what we're building now. I'd like to think they'll at least acknowledge we existed and try to make something worthwhile. Vulnara was quiet for a long moment. Her ears tilted back in what Marcus was learning indicated deep thought. Vacheron philosophy emphasizes forward momentum over historical sentiment. We preserve records for practical reference, but don't attach emotional significance to abandoned infrastructure. What you're describing would be considered inefficient nostalgia in my culture. Maybe that's what makes us human. Inefficient nostalgia and the belief that history matters even when it's not practically useful. Perhaps. She met his eyes directly. Or perhaps my culture's emphasis on efficiency has caused us to lose something valuable. I've been trained to assess strategic assets and threat potential. Watching you this past week has made me realize that assessment misses significant psychological and cultural complexity. Marcus felt suddenly self-conscious. I'm not that complex. I'm just a guy who talks to himself and has opinions about memorial plaques. You conducted a 17-minute debate yesterday about whether the station's failed quantum drives should be studied for historical research or destroyed, because they represent a dangerous technology. You concluded that understanding failure is more valuable than eliminating risk, but acknowledged the counterarguments with genuine consideration. That's not simple thinking. That's sophisticated ethical reasoning that your organization apparently doesn't value based on your supervisor's responses to your reports. But you read my reports. I accessed your personal logs during my second day of observation. Standard intelligence protocol. She said it without apparent shame. Your official reports to Reclamation Corps are significantly less detailed than your personal notes. You self-censor the ethical considerations, presumably because you've learned they're not valued by your superiors. Marcus should have been angry about the privacy violation, but mostly he was just tired. Director Kamara told me during my last evaluation that I think too much about things that don't matter. She wants me to focus on extraction efficiency and stop questioning the larger implications. Then Director Kamara is strategically short-sighted. Understanding the larger implications is what prevents catastrophic failures from being repeated. Gulnara leaned forward slightly. This is what I meant about intelligence assessment's missing complexity. Official human psychological profiles emphasize emotional volatility and strategic impulsiveness. They don't mention the capacity for nuanced ethical reasoning or the tendency to anthropomorphize environments as a form of respect. We're full of contradictions. It's part of the package. All species are full of contradictions. The question is whether those contradictions represent dysfunction or sophisticated adaptation. She paused. Watching you work has challenged several of my assumptions about human cognition. You're simultaneously chaotic and methodical, emotionally expressive and analytically rigorous. It's fascinating. Marcus felt heat creep up his neck. I'm not sure being called fascinating by an intelligence operative is necessarily a compliment. It's an observation. Whether it's complimentary depends on your perspective. Gulnara's expression shifted into something that might have been amusement. Though I should mention that fascination implies positive interest in Vashran's social context. I'm not analyzing you as a threat. I'm trying to understand you as a person, which is apparently not the same thing and requires different methodological approaches. That's the nicest way anyone's ever told me they've been spying on me. I prefer to think of it as intensive cultural research with a sample size of 1. She stood, moving to the viewport to look at Earth. Can I ask you something potentially intrusive? You've already read my personal logs and listened to me for 3 days straight. We're probably past the point of polite boundaries. Fair assessment. When you talk to yourself, are you aware you're doing it? Or is it fully automatic behavior? Marcus considered the question. Both. I know I'm doing it in the sense that I'm conscious of verbalizing thoughts, but it doesn't feel performative. It's just how I process complex problems. Talking through the steps helps me organize information and catch errors I might miss if everything stayed internal. That's remarkably efficient from a cognitive perspective. Verbalization creates an auditory feedback loop that allows for real-time error correction. Gulnara turned back to face him. In Vashran military training, we're taught to internalize all processing to maintain operational silence. It's effective for stealth operations, but potentially counterproductive for complex problem-solving. Your approach might actually be superior in non-combat contexts. I'm going to choose to take that as a compliment and not think too hard about the non-combat context qualifier. Wise decision. She returned to her seat, regarding him with an expression that suggested she was still analyzing, but had shifted from professional assessment to personal curiosity. How long have you been alone out here? 73 days. Contract is for 90, assuming I don't find anything that requires extended evaluation. I arrived 8 days ago. My assessment was supposed to take 3 days maximum, but I've been delaying my report to command because I'm uncertain how to characterize what I've observed. Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. You're going to have to report eventually. Yes, and when I do, I'll need to explain why I spent a week watching a human engineer instead of conducting standard reconnaissance, and why my findings suggest our entire approach to human intelligence gathering may be fundamentally flawed. She met his eyes. That conversation will be professionally uncomfortable. Will you get in trouble? Potentially. Vashran Intelligence Corps values efficiency and clarity. I learned more from listening to one human talk to himself than from analyzing 3 years of official reports, is not a finding that will be well received by my superiors. But it's true, completely true, which makes it more problematic. Gulnara's ears tilted back. Standard intelligence assessment treats individuals as data points, behavioral patterns to be categorized, threat levels to be calculated, strategic value to be determined. But you're not a data point. You're a person with complex motivations and ethical considerations, and a tendency to debate with malfunctioning equipment. Understanding that complexity required actual engagement rather than passive observation, and that's not how we're trained to operate. Marcus absorbed this, so what are you going to do? File an honest report. Recommend a complete reassessment of human intelligence protocols based on evidence that standard observation methodologies miss critical psychological and cultural nuances. Accept whatever professional consequences follow. She said it calmly, but Marcus heard the weight underneath. Some findings are too important to suppress just because they're inconvenient for institutional frameworks. That's either very brave or very reckless. In my experience, those are often the same thing. Vulnara stood again, restless energy suggesting the conversation was touching something uncomfortable. The alternative is to file a standard report that treats you as a data point rather than a person, and I find I'm no longer capable of that level of professional detachment. Because I'm fascinating. Marcus tried for light and wasn't sure he achieved it. Because you made me question whether intelligence that doesn't include actual understanding is intelligent at all. She moved toward the exit, then paused. I should continue my assessment. I've been inefficient today. Or maybe you've been exactly as efficient as you needed to be. Marcus surprised himself with his own boldness. Same time tomorrow. I promise to bring different terrible food, so we can expand our catalog of nutritional disappointments. Vulnara's smile was small but genuine. 1900 hours. I'll look forward to it, which is apparently another inefficiency I'm developing. She disappeared into the station's shadows, and Marcus sat alone in the observation deck, watching Earth rotate slowly and feeling less isolated than he had in months. Somewhere in the intersection of salvage work and intelligence gathering, in the space between human verbal processing and Vashran analytical silence, something unexpected was taking shape. He wasn't sure what to call it yet, but it felt important in ways that transcended protocol and proper procedure. "Well," he said to the empty deck, then smiled. "I know you're not actually here anymore, but this is still weird and I don't know how to process it. So I'm just going to keep talking to myself and hope that someday this all makes sense." From somewhere in the station's depths, so faint he almost missed it, came Vulnara's voice. "It makes sense already. You just haven't realized it yet." Marcus laughed, and the sound filled the observation deck with warmth that had nothing to do with the environmental controls, and everything to do with the possibility that 73 days of isolation might be finally, unexpectedly, coming to an end. By day 82 of Marcus's contract, he and Vulnara had established a routine that would have horrified both their supervisors and probably violated at least 6 different interspecies protocol agreements if anyone had known about it. They worked independently during the day, Marcus on salvage operations in the station's power and life support sections, Vulnara conducting her strategic assessment in the experimental technology wings, and met every evening at 1900 hours in the observation deck to share meals that remained consistently terrible and conversations that had become the highlight of Marcus's entire assignment. Tonight, Vulnara arrived carrying what appeared to be a small electronic device, and an expression that suggested she'd made a discovery she was either very pleased or very concerned about. Marcus had learned to read the subtle differences in her ear positions. Forward meant focused interest, back meant deep thought, and the current slight tilt meant she was processing something complex and wanted his perspective on it. "I found something in Section 12, she said without preamble, settling into what had become her usual seat, the one position to keep both the entrance and the viewport in her peripheral vision, because apparently some training never fully deactivated. The station's original research logs. They're encrypted, but Vashran cryptography is approximately 40 years more advanced than human systems from this era. I decoded them." Marcus felt a spike of interest. What did they say? The quantum drive failures weren't accidental. They were deliberate sabotage by one of the research team who'd concluded the technology was too dangerous to deploy. Vulnara activated the device, projecting a holographic display of text in a language Marcus couldn't read but which she apparently could. Dr. Sarah Chen spent 3 months documenting the drive's instability, trying to convince her colleagues to halt testing. When they refused, she introduced a subtle flaw into the containment algorithms that guaranteed catastrophic failure before the drives could be weaponized. Weaponized? Marcus leaned forward. I thought these were propulsion systems. They were, but quantum fold technology can theoretically be adapted into planet-scale destructive devices. Dr. Chen realized this before her colleagues did, or perhaps they realized and didn't care. The logs aren't entirely clear on that point. Either way, she made a decision that ended the project, destroyed 47 people's life work, and possibly prevented a weapon that could crack worlds. Vulnara's expression was complicated. She left a final log entry explaining her reasoning. Would you like to hear it? Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. Vulnara adjusted the projection, and a human woman's voice filled the observation deck, tired, sad, and absolutely certain. To whoever finds this, I know what I've done looks like betrayal. My colleagues trusted me, and I sabotaged our work deliberately and with full understanding of the consequences. But I've run the calculations 17 different ways, and they all end the same. This technology in the wrong hands means death on a scale we can't comprehend. Maybe in the future, someone wiser will figure out how to make quantum fold drives safe. But we're not wise enough yet, and I won't let my name be attached to galactic-scale destruction just because we were too proud to admit we weren't ready. If you're listening to this, I hope you understand. And if you don't, I hope you're at least careful with whatever you're building. The universe doesn't forgive hubris. The recording ended, and silence settled over the observation deck like a weight. Marcus found he'd been holding his breath and released it slowly. She sacrificed everything to prevent a weapon that might never have been built. Or she prevented a catastrophe that would have killed billions. The uncertainty makes it more remarkable, not less. Vulnara closed the projection. I've been thinking about your argument regarding memorial preservation. Dr. Chen's name is on that plaque you wanted to save. She's listed as a primary researcher, with no indication of what she actually did. If we melt that plaque down, her real contribution disappears. People will only know the quantum drives failed, not that someone had the courage to make them fail deliberately. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, understanding clicking into place. This is why you've been delaying your report. You found this days ago. 3 days ago, yes. And I've been trying to determine whether strategic intelligence requires me to inform Vashran Command about potential quantum weapon applications, or whether Dr. Chen's sacrifice means I have an obligation to let this technology stay buried. She looked at him directly. You're the one who conducts ethical debates with machinery. I'm asking for your perspective. It was the most trust Marcus had ever been offered by someone he'd known for less than 2 weeks, and he felt the weight of it. What does Vashran military doctrine say about theoretical weapons technology? That all strategic information must be reported and assessed by qualified personnel who will determine appropriate action. Vulnara's voice was carefully neutral. Not reporting represents a significant breach of protocol and a potential court-martial offense. But you're considering not reporting it anyway. I'm considering whether following protocol in this instance honors Dr. Chen's sacrifice or negates it. I'm considering whether intelligence gathering should include ethical judgment or remain purely informational. I'm considering, she stopped, ears tilting back in what Marcus now recognized as frustration. I'm considering that watching you talk through complex problems for 2 weeks has infected me with your tendency toward ethical deliberation, and I'm uncertain whether to be grateful or concerned about that development. Marcus couldn't help smiling slightly. Welcome to the burden of thinking too much about things that don't matter, according to my supervisor. Your supervisor is wrong. These things matter immensely. Vulnara stood, moving to the viewport in what had become her thinking position. Vashran culture prizes clarity and efficiency. Ethical ambiguity is considered a weakness, evidence of insufficient data or compromised judgment. But Dr. Chen had perfect clarity about what she was preventing, and she still chose ambiguity, sacrifice, and permanent uncertainty about whether her choice was correct. That's not weakness. That's a form of courage my training never addressed. So what are you going to do? I genuinely don't know, which is itself a novel experience. She turned back to face him. If I report everything, Vashran Command will potentially pursue quantum weapon research, which might lead to exactly what Dr. Chen tried to prevent. If I omit the weapons application from my report, I'm making an ethical judgment that I'm not officially authorized to make, and potentially withholding information that could be strategically critical. Marcus thought about Dr. Chen's voice, tired and sad and absolutely certain. Can I ask what you personally think should happen? Not Operative Vulnara of the Intelligence Corps, just you as a person who's been studying this station and thinking about what it means. Personally, Vulnara was quiet for a long moment. Personally, I think Dr. Chen made a choice that cost her everything to prevent harm she couldn't prove would occur, and I think that choice deserves to be honored rather than made meaningless by my report triggering exactly what she tried to stop. But I'm not certain whether personal conviction is sufficient justification for withholding strategic intelligence. What if you reported the logs, but recommended against pursuing weapons applications based on Dr. Chen's assessment? Recommendations can be ignored. Once information is submitted, I have no control over how it's used. She moved back to her seat, looking more uncertain than Marcus had ever seen her. This is why Vashran avoid attachment to observed subjects. It compromises analytical objectivity. I'm supposed to assess strategic value, not form opinions about whether Dr. Chen's sacrifice deserves protection. But you have formed opinions, because she's not just a data point. She's a person who made an impossible choice, and understanding that matters. Yes, which means my assessment is compromised by empathy, which means my judgment is potentially flawed, which means... Vulnara stopped, then laughed shortly. I'm caught in a recursive loop of questioning my own judgment, which is itself evidence that my judgment is compromised. This is remarkably frustrating. Marcus found himself moving closer, operating on instinct rather than careful thought. Maybe compromised judgment is actually better judgment in situations like this. Maybe pure analytical objectivity misses important factors that empathy catches. That's a comforting philosophy for someone who talks to themselves constantly and conducts ethical debates with power regulators. It's worked reasonably well so far. I haven't accidentally destroyed any stations. Yet, you've only been here 82 days. But Vulnara was almost smiling. If you were in my position, what would you do? Honestly, I'd probably spend 3 days having lengthy debates with myself about duty versus conscience, eventually conclude that some knowledge should stay buried, omit the weapons application from my report, and then spend the next several years wondering if I made the right choice. Marcus paused. But I'd rather live with that uncertainty than know I potentially enabled exactly what Dr. Chen died trying to prevent, even if it means violating professional obligations. Sometimes professional obligations conflict with moral ones. When they do, I'd rather be the person who chose conscience even if it costs me. He met her eyes. But that's easy for me to say. I'm not the one who'd face court-martial for it. Vulnara was quiet for a long time, her ears cycling through several positions before settling into what looked like resolution. I'm going to file my report tomorrow. I'll include everything about the station's strategic value and the quantum drive research, but I'll characterize Dr. Chen's actions as an unresolved equipment failure rather than deliberate sabotage. The weapon's application will be omitted. If my superiors discover the deception later, I'll accept the consequences. That's a significant risk. Yes, but you've spent 2 weeks teaching me, unintentionally but effectively, that some things matter more than career advancement and protocol compliance. Dr. Chen's sacrifice deserves to mean something, and I refuse to be the person who negates it just because I was too concerned with following orders to exercise ethical judgment. Marcus felt something warm settle in his chest. For someone who was trained to avoid attachment to observed subjects, you've gotten remarkably attached. A troubling development that I'll need to examine extensively once this assignment concludes. Vulnara's expression softened. Though I suspect the attachment isn't entirely to Dr. Chen's memory, you've been a problematic influence, Engineer Akoy. I prefer educational influence with challenging methodologies. Of course you do. She stood, preparing to leave for her sections of the station. Same time tomorrow, though I should warn you that after I submit my report, Vashran Command will likely send an extraction team within 3 to 5 days. Our evening coordination meetings will need to conclude. The thought of the observation deck returning to empty silence made Marcus's chest tighten more than he wanted to examine. Then, we should make the most of the time we have. I'll bring the absolute worst freeze-dried option I can find. I think there's a vegetable medley that might actually constitute a war crime. I look forward to the culinary horror with inappropriate enthusiasm. Vulnara moved toward the exit, then paused. Marcus, thank you for helping me think through something my training never prepared me for. Any time. Though I should mention that my method of helping mostly involved asking questions and being uncertain about everything. Sometimes that's exactly what's needed. She disappeared into the station's shadows, and Marcus sat alone in the observation deck, thinking about Dr. Chen's sacrifice and Vulnara's choice, and the strange weight of decisions that mattered beyond protocol and procedure. You know what's interesting? He said to the empty deck, old habits resurfacing. I came out here to be alone, and instead I found someone who actually listens, and she found someone who talks enough for both of them. That's either cosmic irony or unexpected grace, and I'm not sure which. No answer came from the shadows this time, but Marcus found he didn't need one. Some truths existed in the space between speech and silence, and understanding them required only the courage to keep talking and the wisdom to truly hear. The message from Vashran Command arrived on day 87, encrypted with classification levels that made Vulnara's expression shift into what Marcus had learned meant professionally controlled alarm. She'd come to the observation deck early, interrupting Marcus's pre-evening routine of arguing with a particularly stubborn environmental control panel about its continued existence, and her usual composed demeanor had fractured slightly around the edges. Problem? Marcus asked, setting aside his tools and moving to join her. Command is displeased with my delayed reporting timeline. They're dispatching an extraction team and formal assessment unit. Arrival in 48 hours. She closed the display with more force than necessary. They'll expect comprehensive intelligence findings, strategic value analysis, and explanation for why my 3-day reconnaissance assignment extended to 2 weeks. That's not ideal. Significant understatement. Vulnara moved to the viewport, staring at Earth with the intensity of someone trying to find answers in planetary rotation. The assessment unit will review all my findings, including the decision to characterize Dr. Chen's sabotage as equipment failure. If they access the original research logs, which they absolutely will because they're thorough and suspicious by nature, they'll realize I deliberately omitted weapons application intelligence. Marcus felt his stomach drop, which means court-martial, which means extensive professional consequences, potential criminal charges depending on how Command chooses to frame the omission, and definitely the end of my intelligence career. She said it calmly, but her ears were flat against her skull in what Marcus now recognized as suppressed distress. I knew this was possible when I made the choice. I'm prepared to accept accountability. Are you, though? Marcus moved to stand beside her, because accepting accountability in theory is different from actually facing it. I'll manage. Vashran military training includes extensive preparation for consequence acceptance. But her voice suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as him. The assessment unit will also discover our evening coordination meetings, which will raise questions about potential compromise. They'll want to interview you. Interview meaning what exactly? Formal intelligence interrogation to determine whether I've been manipulated, whether you've extracted classified information, whether our interaction represents a security breach requiring correction. Vilnara finally looked at him. They'll be professional but thorough, and they won't particularly care whether you find the process comfortable. Marcus processed this. So in 48 hours, your career ends and I get interrogated by Vashran intelligence operatives who think I'm a security risk. That's a significant change from discussing terrible freeze-dried food and the ethics of memorial plaques. Yes, I'm sorry. I should have maintained proper operational distance instead of allowing personal interaction to compromise professional judgment. She turned away. This is why attachment is problematic. It creates cascading consequences for everyone involved. Hey, Marcus waited until she looked back at him. I don't regret the past 2 weeks. Even knowing it ends badly, I'd rather have had these conversations than spent another month alone arguing with machinery. If you're going to face consequences for treating me like a person instead of a data point, I want you to know that mattered. It meant something. Vilnara's expression cycled through several configurations before settling on something vulnerable. It meant something to me as well, which is itself evidence of compromised objectivity. I was supposed to assess strategic value. Instead, I learned about human cognitive processing and ethical reasoning, and the fact that verbal externalization serves legitimate psychological functions. I learned that Dr. Chen's sacrifice deserves protection, and that some intelligence should stay buried, and that choosing conscience over protocol doesn't feel like weakness even though it should. She paused. I learned that maybe intelligence gathering that treats people as data points isn't actually intelligent. That's pretty revolutionary thinking for someone in your position. It's career-ending thinking, but it's also correct, which makes the professional consequences somewhat easier to accept. Vilnara pulled up her display again. I'm going to file a supplemental report tonight before the assessment unit arrives. Full documentation of my reasoning for omitting weapons application intelligence. Acknowledgement that I allowed personal judgment to influence professional decisions, and recommendation that Vashran Intelligence Corps revise their protocols to include ethical assessment rather than purely strategic analysis. That's either very brave or deliberately self-destructive. Potentially both. But if I'm facing consequences regardless, I'd rather they be for complete honesty than for deception discovered later. She began composing, her long fingers moving rapidly across the holographic interface. I'm going to need your help with part of this. Specifically, I need you to explain why verbal processing is cognitively beneficial rather than undisciplined, and why human ethical reasoning represents sophisticated adaptation rather than strategic weakness. Marcus felt something tighten in his throat. You want me to testify that you weren't compromised, you were learning. I want you to help me prove that understanding people requires engagement rather than just observation, and that intelligence gathering missing that dimension is fundamentally incomplete. She glanced at him. Consider it your contribution to revolutionary intelligence reform that will almost certainly fail but might plant seeds for future reconsideration. That's the most pessimistically optimistic thing I've ever heard. I'm absolutely in. They worked through the night, Vilnara drafting her formal assessment while Marcus provided what he mentally categorized as the human perspective, explanations of cognitive processing, discussions of ethical reasoning, arguments that treating individuals as complex beings rather than strategic assets produced better intelligence outcomes. Vulnara translated his verbose rambling into language her superiors might accept, weaving intelligence analysis together with what amounted to an academic paper on cross-species understanding. This is either going to revolutionize Vashran intelligence protocols or serve as evidence of complete professional collapse, Vulnara observed around hour 4 of drafting, possibly both simultaneously. Revolutionary professional collapse. That should definitely be the title of your autobiography. Marcus rubbed his eyes, exhausted but strangely energized by the collaborative work. For what it's worth, I think what you're arguing is important, not just for Vashran human relations, but for the basic principle that maybe we should try to understand each other instead of just calculating strategic advantages. A remarkably idealistic position for someone who spends their days dismantling abandoned infrastructure for profit. I contain multitudes, remember. You've documented them extensively. Marcus smiled despite the tension. Besides, Dr. Chen chose idealism over practicality and possibly saved billions of lives in the process. Seems like a reasonable precedent to follow. Dr. Chen also destroyed her career and died in obscurity with everyone believing she'd simply made a technical error. But she knew the truth, and now you know it, and you're choosing to honor her choice even though it costs you. Marcus met Vulnara's eyes. That matters more than whether anyone else acknowledges it. Vulnara was quiet for a moment, then returned to the report with renewed focus. They finished as the station's chronometer indicated 400 hours, both exhausted and uncertain, but somehow satisfied with what they'd created. A document that was part intelligence assessment, part philosophical argument, and entirely career-ending for its author. Submitting now, Vulnara said, her finger hovering over the transmission control. Last chance to suggest modifications or express concerns about being cited extensively throughout. Send it. Let's make your superiors earn their rank by actually thinking about something complicated. The report transmitted, and they sat in silence watching the progress indicator until it confirmed delivery to Vashran Command. Vulnara closed her display and leaned back in her chair, looking more relaxed than Marcus had seen her in days despite having just potentially ended her career. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for helping me articulate something my training never gave me language for. Thank you for listening to 2 weeks of me talking to myself and deciding it was worth understanding rather than just cataloging." Marcus hesitated, then added, "What happens now, after the assessment unit arrives?" "They'll review my findings, conduct their interrogation, determine appropriate consequences. You'll likely be recalled to Reclamation Corps for debriefing. We'll both file extensive reports about our interaction here, and bureaucrats will spend months arguing about jurisdictional protocols and proper procedure." She smiled slightly. "The most probable outcome is that we never see each other again, and this becomes an interesting footnote in both our personnel files." "That's depressing." "It's realistic. Cross-species personal connections are administratively complicated and usually not worth the effort required to maintain them." But something in Vulnara's expression suggested she found that outcome as disappointing as Marcus did. "Though if Vashran Command doesn't court-martial me, and if they actually implement any of my recommendations about revised intelligence protocols, there's a possibility I'll be assigned to develop new cross-species assessment methodologies. That would require consultation with human psychological experts. Would it now?" Marcus felt something like hope stir. "And would those consultations require working with humans who have experience with verbal processing and ethical reasoning?" "Potentially. Someone who could explain cognitive strategies from a practical perspective rather than just theoretical analysis." Vulnara's ears tilted forward. "Someone who's been extensively observed and documented engaging in natural verbal processing while solving complex problems." That's remarkably specific criteria. I wonder if anyone fits that description. Only one person I'm aware of, though he has the disadvantage of being verbose and prone to conducting ethical debates with malfunctioning equipment. Those sound like advantages in the right context. Perhaps. Volnara stood, moving toward the exit as the station's chronometer indicated the start of day cycle. We have approximately 36 hours before the extraction team arrives. I should complete my strategic assessment documentation. You should probably finish your salvage work and prepare for recall. Marcus stood as well, aware they were approaching some kind of ending but uncertain of its exact shape. Same time tonight, or is that too compromising given everything? Tonight at 1900 hours. We're already compromised. We might as well enjoy our remaining time engaging in administratively inappropriate personal interaction. She paused at the exit. Bring whatever terrible freeze-dried option you've been saving for special occasions. We should mark this properly. I have a chocolate pudding variant that supposedly tastes like sweetened despair. It's been waiting for the right moment. Perfect. I'll look forward to the culinary horror with entirely inappropriate enthusiasm. She disappeared into the station's corridors, and Marcus stood alone in the observation deck watching Earth rotate through another dawn. In 36 hours, everything would change. Volnara would face consequences for choosing understanding over protocol. Marcus would return to the loneliness of solo salvage operations, and their unlikely collaboration would become nothing more than documentation in classified files that probably no one would ever read with real comprehension. But they had 36 more hours. 36 hours of terrible food and good conversation, of debating ethics and understanding across the space between cultures, of proving that sometimes the most valuable intelligence came from treating people as people rather than strategic assets. You know what? Marcus said to the empty deck, old habits surfacing one more time. I came out here thinking isolation was safe, that keeping distance prevented complications. But Volnara showed me that sometimes complications are where the actual important stuff happens. Sometimes what looks like compromise is actually clarity, and what looks like risk is actually courage, and what looks like career-ending honesty is actually the only kind of integrity that matters. From somewhere in the station's depths, closer than he expected, came Volnara's voice. I'm still listening, Marcus. I'm always listening now. He smiled, feeling less alone than he had in years. Good. Because I've still got about 36 hours of thoughts to process verbally, and it'd be inefficient to waste them. Remarkably inefficient. I'll expect comprehensive verbal processing at 1900 hours. It's a date. Still not a date. A professional coordination meeting with inappropriate personal elements. I understood your intent. Human linguistic imprecision is noted and accepted. They fell silent, separated by corridors but connected by something neither of them had planned for and both recognized as valuable. A partnership built on listening and being heard, on honesty that cost everything and meant more because of it, on the revolutionary idea that maybe intelligence required understanding rather than just information. In 48 hours, bureaucracy would reassert itself, proper protocol would be restored, and they'd both face whatever consequences came from choosing conscience over convenience. But they had right now, and 36 more hours beyond it, and that was enough to prove that sometimes the most important connections happened in the least expected places, between the most unlikely people, through the simple courage of saying what you meant and truly hearing what someone else was trying to say. Marcus returned to his salvage work, talking through each step like he always did, aware now that someone was listening and finding comfort in that knowledge. Volnara continued her assessment, working in her preferred silence but thinking about verbal processing and ethical reasoning, and the strange beauty of watching someone trust the void enough to speak their truth into it. And somewhere in the space between speech and silence, in the careful documentation of two people trying to understand each other across the divide of culture and training and entirely different ways of thinking. Something revolutionary took shape, not loud enough to change everything immediately, but persistent enough to plant seeds that might, someday, grow into forests of genuine understanding. The universe, it turned out, had room for both silence and speech, for protocol and conscience, for intelligence that came from data and intelligence that came from truly listening. All it required was the courage to admit that maybe we didn't have all the answers, and the wisdom to learn from people who thought differently than we did, and the honesty to say that sometimes what looked like compromise was actually the clearest thinking we'd ever done. Marcus talked, Vilnara listened, and in the intersection of those two impulses, something remarkable happened that neither of them had planned for but both recognized as worth whatever it cost. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes that was